Now, maybe I could just kick off one quick question, just to let folks know we've got to break this meeting at 20 past, because you, I understand, have got to get to a critical meeting, so we have a little less time than we would usually. So let me just put one quick question on the front, and I'll open it up and catch people's eye as we go along, as we would normally do. Britain, great trading nation, and yet we've been running a trade deficit collectively for as far back as I've looked recently, a good at least 10 years. And it's stayed relatively stable. Surplus in services, deficit in goods throughout that period, and obviously the deficit in goods outweighing the surplus in services. Why? I suppose would be my question. You've got countries that are inside the EU, like Germany and so on, that are particularly successful at being able to export. We've done very well vis-a-vis China. We've picked up a lot. But in many of the emerging markets, from what I can see, UK's remained relatively static in its ability to break through to some of those other emerging markets. But why has Britain, this great trading nation, been stuck for so long as a deficit country on the trade front?
I think we just need to, and one of the reasons is we need to do a lot better in boosting exports, promoting exports. If you look at those countries that have run either smaller deficits or indeed surpluses, you look at Germany, for example, or even Italy and even France in our European rivals, they've been much better, especially when it comes to emerging markets, of taking advantage of that and getting more of their exports into those markets. Now, I spent, before politics, I spent 20 years working in emerging markets, and I've seen just how radically they've changed in over that period. And I think we have been, and I saw this when I was in the private sector, we have been behind as a country in trying to help British exporters in those markets. What we're doing about that now is that we have this task force that I chair with other cabinet ministers and board, and one thing we recognise, and I think this hasn't been done in the past, is that boosting exports is something that's the responsibility of the whole of government. It's not just my department or the Treasury, it's a whole of government approach. So if we want more food and drink exports, for example, then the Environment Department should be involved, the transport in helping to sell infrastructure abroad. So that's one big change. But also, I want us to focus more where the government's help is asked for. I want government to only focus where government can make a difference. I think we've been too spread out too much. We've been trying to help people to either export into other EU countries or into the US, where frankly they don't need that much help. Where you do need help is if you want to get into China or into India or into Brazil, because there can be a lot of sort of government-to-government work, or there can be bureaucracy. So we need to reset how we look at exports. It's happening, but I think that's one of the key explanations why we just haven't done well enough.
And do you think, just to follow this up, is there an extent to which what we sell has proved to be less attractive? Obviously, the services market, where, as you noted, UK is particularly strong. I think we're the second largest exporter of services in the world, highest per capita. Those are markets that tend to be a bit more closed. Obviously, where markets are a bit more open, those tend to be in the goods kind of space, where maybe we've been less strong. Is it smaller, medium-sized businesses, less export-focused? I mean, is it all a government problem? You said boosting or not boosting. How much of it is internal to the UK?
Well, I think there is something to be said that given some of our strengths are in service sectors, and as you say, and I've sort of mentioned in my speech, they do tend to be more regulated. So it does, especially with the emerging markets, it does take a bit more time to open up those markets. But I think that if I use that explanation and folks, I think it would be a lazy response for me. I don't. There's so many sectors in manufacturing that we are very, very good at. Where it's aerospace, it's automotive, it's pharmaceuticals, and many, many more. And we still haven't done as well as we should have. And so. I don't want to use some lazy excuse and just say it's just because we're good at services. I think we just haven't focused on it enough. We haven't given, for example, some of the smaller exporters, the smaller companies, the SMEs, as much help as we could have. And if you look at, I looked at recently at a scheme in Italy where they're sort of equivalent to what we call UKTI, their export promotion agency. They've put a lot of time and effort working with some of the sort of more medium-sized manufacturers, encourage them to export, almost holding their hand to the entire process for certain countries. And I think we can learn from that.
Great. Specific answers. Let me take a few questions, probably one at a time to start with, and then I'll open it up as we went along. First there, then here, then here. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Javid, for the introduction you made. I'm Ana Escovedo from ArcelorMittal. I want to address a question regarding the explanation you made a bit against the exports and the deficit the UK is facing. From an industrial perspective, a steel manufacturer, we see exports depend very much on competitiveness of the industry, competitiveness of the different products that you sell abroad. The competitive on the industry depends on the fairness of the market more than the free market. Based on this, I would like to ask your view on what will be a position of the UK government to understand the competitiveness of the industry against the decision that needs to be made in Europe before 2016 of granting China market economy status. That will put in a very unfair conditions most of the industries in Europe that export. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think you take the first part of the question about fairness. I mean, you're absolutely right. And in my talk, talk about the two key points. It's about free trade, absolutely, but it's got to be seen to be fair. And steel, I think, is a good example of where there is currently a lot of unfairness. How does that manifest itself? There's a huge amount of overproduction in some countries. And in those countries, often there's a huge amount of government subsidy that goes into, direct subsidy into producing that steel. And it's not something that British or other European steelmakers can hope to really properly compete against. And that's why we've been at the forefront through the EU calling for proper and faster investigations into anti-dumping allegations that are being made, and also around state aid on trying to create a more level field by having an approach towards high electricity costs, often by other EU policies that are pushing up the cost to all business, but particularly for an energy-intensive company like a steel producer, it has a big impact on its competitiveness. So we're making applications to have relief from some of those policies. So I think that is part of the answer of trying to respond to unfairness where you see it. But in terms of your particular question at the end about China and market economy status, China, when it had its accession to the WTO, the deal was that by the end of 2016, there will be a decision made about whether it's a market economy or not. And I felt all along that I think it's just it's quite clear. I think it's the most logical view is that decision must be based on evidence. Either it's a market economy or not. It must be based on evidence. It shouldn't be a political decision for anyone. I think legally it has to be an evidence-based decision, and that's the approach. So I don't know what the exact sort of evidence is going to show by 2016 when this decision has to be made, but it should be driven by the evidence.
Okay. Question down here.
Thank you. Thank you, Paola Subacchi, Chatham House. In your description of the free trade that you eloquently described, an element is actually free movement of people as well as free movement of capital. So my question to you is, in your definition of single market in Europe, do you include free movement of people as well as capital, or you just see it as a custom union back as it was in the 1970s, so even?
Yeah, I don't think the free movement of people is as important as the free movement of goods and services. And that's why my emphasis has been on goods and services and reducing barriers to trading those, having some common set of standards, especially services and modern digital products.
That's a direct answer. I mean, just quickly on that, I was writing it down. From many EU members' standpoint, the openness of markets to goods, and especially if one's going to add services as well, the EU is made up of some markets that are much less competitive and some that are much more competitive, and the differentials are pretty wide, especially when we start to look to Central Eastern Europe. Obviously, they will see their trade in people almost as compensating for our competitiveness in the UK or Germany or others in terms of goods. You said you see it being more one or the other, but in a market that's as deeply integrated as the single market of the EU, and one that you would like to deepen even further, digital services, capital markets. These are very sensitive areas for many economies, especially those that are the least competitive. You have no sympathy for that balance, that from their point of view, the ability in a way to trade people, why they're moving up the value chain.
No, my point, I don't see it as the priority. You know, we haven't got the basics right yet, which is trading in goods and services in a proper, deep single market. And there's still so much work to do on that. And I think that's where the focus and the effort should be.
And then we'll see how the rest flows out from that. Thank you. First gentleman here. I see lots of hands going up now. I'll catch as many as I can. I'll start grouping them at some point. Yeah.
Thank you, John Culhane. One thing you didn't particularly mention as an important constituent of prosperity, but which is equally unpopular as free trade, is competition. And competition is, as I think you've touched on, but haven't really gone into, something where governments can help. For example, it is hard to expect a steel company to compete globally when its electricity costs are double anybody else. And I think that the emphasis on and the importance of competition, of Schumpeter's creative destruction, is something on which governments ought to focus more than they currently do. Thank you.
Yeah, I very much agree with that and the importance the gentleman places on competition. In fact, that's at the heart of another strategy that was published at the start of this new government, which was the productivity plan that I launched sort of a few weeks after the new government was formed. And it stresses the importance of competition and sets out some of the things that we need to do. In fact, in the coming weeks and months, I'll be laying out a lot more work that the government will do precisely to boost competition, because it goes, I think, to the heart of boosting productivity.
Please, there first. Yeah, I'll get you later, sir. Yeah.
John Peet from The Economist. Given what you said about the benefits of being part of the world's biggest free trade bloc, especially when it's negotiating free trade deals with America and other places, I wonder if you would now share the view expressed again this morning by Stuart Rose, that it's a good time for British business, and indeed for the Confederation of British Industry, to talk up the benefits of remaining in the EU and the possible risks of leaving.
I would say that the one thing that all businesses agree on, and I talked about financial services in my speech, but I think you can apply this equally to all businesses, and certainly the groups that I've met with, whether it's the CBI, the IOD, or others, or even individual businesses, is that the EU needs significant reform, especially when it comes to competitiveness. We talked about free trade, single market. You could talk about red tape. It needs significant reform. And the only way we're going to get that reform, or have a chance to even have a debate about it, is because we've got this referendum. And that has really focused minds amongst our European partners. They're sitting around the table having serious discussion with us on these issues. And that's what our focus, the government's focus is on. And for businesses that want to see that reform, they should talk about the reform they want to see, and maybe talk to some of their European counterparts to tell them how serious Britain is to get these changes. And at the end of that process, when we have the referendum, is probably the best time for people to say what they think of the result and which way they want to go.
Okay, gentleman here first, yeah, right at the front. Microphone coming. It's coming.
My name is Prasad. I'm a member of Chatham House and an economist. Since the Second World War, we have made considerable progress in freeing international trade through the GATT and more laterally through the WTO. But over the last 15 years or so, we have made little progress in freeing trade on a global basis. In fact, because of the recent downturn in the world economy in recent years, there might have even been some reversal. On the other hand, considerable progress is being made in freeing trade on a regional basis, in setting up regional free trade areas. Now, how do you see the future? It is proving very difficult to make advances internationally through the WTO. We haven't succeeded in negotiating a new trade round for the last 20 years. How do you see the future? Is it through regional trade agreements and linking regional trade agreements, and in that way we make progress towards freeing international trade?
Yeah, is it region to region?
Yeah, I think so. There's certainly a role for region to region, but I wouldn't give up too easily on much more broader scale. So take the WTO with their agreement, the trade facilitation agreement, which isn't effective yet, but there's an agreement and countries are signing up to it, as in they're ratifying it. I think, if I'm right, so you've got like 160 members of the WTO, most of the world, and it requires 2/3 of countries to ratify it, to bring it into effect. And of those, I think some 50, 60 have done that. The UK has done that. And I'm confident that it will happen. And that agreement in itself, so a relatively new agreement, when that's ratified and that's effective, it will help bring down trade barriers further. It will certainly cut opportunities for corruption and customs checks and things. And the estimate is, the number of estimates, that it will add around $120, $130 billion to the world economy. We think it will add about £1 billion to the British GDP. And that's, that is an agreement on a very, very large scale. So I think we should always continue with that. I think when we have this sort of Nairobi round of WTO, we should be as ambitious as we can. I think everyone accepts when you have so many countries around the table, there's going to be lots of varying interests and different priorities, and it's always going to be very hard. But regionally, I think you can get things done, as well as we've just seen with the US and the TPP as well. So I think you can have an approach to both, but I think you're right to sort of identify this regional approach has been picking up, and in some sectors, the US most of all, they've seen success.
Let me group a few questions. I have a lot of hands going up. This gentleman there and the lady there. I'm doing two of you. I've got two here and two here. Let's see if we can. That'll have to close the list, I'm afraid.
Rex Richmarty here, Commercial Director of International Business and Diplomatic Exchange. We have run a successful series on forums on restoring growth and credibility in financial services, and we're also engaged a European Commission here in London on single digital markets and capital market union. On touching on the point where you illustrated by the North and South Korea, and the description of TTIP being a biggest MFA between the biggest economy and the trading bloc, what are the contingencies on the outcome of the Brexit referendum? Be it yes, i.e. to remain with the EU, and then we know what's happening, but be no, doesn't UK risk isolating and being counterproductive when it comes to increasing exports and so on?
Okay, and the lady there, please.
Thanks. Katie Roscoe, Rolls-Royce. My question is really, what more can business do? How can we work better with government to help you achieve your exports targets and agenda?
I'll take those two and I'll see how we're doing on time.
I think you turn to the first question. I mean, our focus is on getting the reform. The Prime Minister made this speech actually about a week ago, where he said it again in a bit more detail what we're looking for. These negotiations are going on, and it's always going to be a bit of a up and down process. But we've made considerable progress since we started the negotiations. So that's our focus. We're not thinking about the alternative. We're focused very positively on getting the reform, and I think that's the best place to be. On what can businesses do to help? There are lots of businesses that try to help, and they actually have approached us when now that we've got this task force looking at new ways to do things. But one way is actually companies like Rolls-Royce, some of the larger, more established companies that are active, very active abroad, and understand international trade perhaps better than some other companies. We're seeing, for example, many of them try to work with some of their suppliers. So particularly, pick Rolls-Royce. You're from there, but I've seen examples of Rolls-Royce is working with some of its key suppliers in the UK, some of those medium and small-sized companies I was referring to earlier that don't particularly export, haven't really thought about it, and Rolls-Royce is lending a hand, saying, look, you can sort of come along with us. We'll introduce you to some of the companies we work with, whether in Singapore or elsewhere. And I think that's just one really sensible, practical way to help.
Right, two questions here. Yeah. two hands are going up, so we'll do one after the other.
Hi, Phil Aldrich from The Times. I just wondered if this EU referendum is actually just a false threat from the way that you're talking about it, because obviously it gets you around the table, but you've been proselytizing about free trade, and it's hardly, if you turn your back on European Union, then that's hardly going to be in interest of free trade. And the 1 trillion export number by 2020, are we going to get there?
Okay, and if you pass the microphone along there, please.
I'm Richard Bennion. I'm here as the chairman of the UK Water Partnership, a government-private sector initiative to try and help UK companies get a larger slice of a $500 billion global marketplace. I mean, amazing companies doing amazing things that find real difficulty in getting the bridging finance they need to get out into the world marketplace. Do you think other countries are better at supporting SMEs in that crucial development phase in order to go and sell their goods and expertise?
Yeah, okay. So the first question was, so Phil, right, on, you said, is the referendum a false threat? I mean, absolutely not. It's a real referendum. There's going to be a real question, and the British people will decide. And, you know, unless we can get the kind of reform that we've talked about, which we're clearly working hard on, the British people, they can go either way they want. And, I have faith in the British people, but I don't think in any way it's a false threat. It's a very real referendum with a very real choice for the British people to make.
So just one little point on that specifically. The EU as a single market, which you said is our biggest 40+% of our exports at the moment. Is the government doing enough to explain that the access to that market requires, in essence, a loss of sovereignty? And one of the big things in the referendum is that many people in the UK feel Parliament's lost too much sovereignty. If you're going to have access to a single market that deals with services and regulations, the deal struck by Margaret Thatcher and others was you'll have to have qualified majority voting. That is a loss of sovereignty of a sort. But in order to gain access to the market, irrespective of what happens in the referendum negotiation, which is where this is not up, but a lot of the debate is around this Parliament must regain sovereignty, not just over the immigration issue, but more broadly, regulations, etc. Are you comfortable with the fact that ultimately one needs to have that dilution, pooling, whatever you want to call it, of sovereignty in order to have access to this big market? Is that point being made clearly enough, or will it be made in the context of this referendum?
I think that is actually well understood, and the arguments that you hear from people, particularly on the doorstep where they have concerns about the EU, it's not. No one stands in front of you and says, I don't like the common market, I don't like the idea that we're going to have a single market in goods and services. It's about many other things. In my talk I referred to the European superstate, where they feel that Europe is getting involved in so many other things that have nothing whatsoever to do with trade, free trade. And that's where I think the concern lies. Phil, the other part of your question was about the target by 2020, $1 trillion exports. And you said, are we going to reach it with great difficulty? It's an aspiration. We're working hard towards it. And part of what my sort of task force that I chair is working on is you looking at that sort of process of where the export growth might come from. But it still does remain an aspiration. Richard, your question about finance, and especially for SMEs, I think it's a really important point. And you said, do other countries is there more access to this kind of finance? And I think that historically there has been. Germany is, having worked for Deutsche Bank, it's another country that I know reasonably well when it comes to finance. And I think the sort of mid-sized companies especially have had, I wouldn't say easy access to finance, but I think they have more opportunities, more options. And that is something that we've tried to change here. It's not something that can change overnight. I think one of the things that we need is much more competition in our banking system. Historically, I think even today, you have the sort of top 5 banks do about 80% of bank lending. And that's not the situation in many other countries, not that concentrated. And there's been some government initiatives, such as the British Business Bank and some of the financing that provides or helps to bring together. And also in innovation, through Innovation UK, part of my department, which will work with companies through grants and other ways to try and help them get them some of that sort of risk finance, which is often the hardest to get to look at new projects. But I think it's an important point, and we've got to do more.
We've gone a bit over time, and I know we had a very hard 20 past, and we're already 22, 23. If I take another round, I'm sorry, in particular, you were the last two hands I saw go up. I'm afraid I will have to cut you back. Thank you very much, Secretary, for sharing your thoughts, playing a very clear card on the transatlantic trade issue, which is going to be very complex, as I think we all understand politically. I was particularly struck by your remarks about joining up government to think about trade as something that's whole of government rather than just your department or the embassies or whatever it is pushing it. And I think the financing issue, by the way, at the end is an area where many other governments that are proving successful seem to have a bit of a leg up compared to the UK. And we'll see how the leverage of the referendum pans out. But if it pans out for Remain, obviously there'll be a whole slew of trade agreements that will then be pursued. If it's the other, then the hypothetical question will be addressed. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you for coming this time in the morning. Please, a strong hand for the Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you.